to Pastor Craig.
Well, good morning, everybody. Happy Sabbath. Man, every seventh day that rolls around is a day of rest. It's been wonderful to be with you here in Minot this week and to focus on how our humanness interacts with God, the divine. And again, that's through the spiritual life. That's how we often refer to it. That's through the emotional, mental, our thinking, our emotions, all that, and understanding that God wired us to experience life richly, and yet we are to guard our hearts and our minds, our thoughts, because those are the drivers of our behaviors. But sometimes we can get stuck in our thinking, and that's exactly where the enemy, the devil, would love us to remain, is to be stuck in negative thinking, particularly when it comes to how we see ourselves and how we value ourselves, because we often connect that to what we do and the feedback we get from others. And, oh, you mean I'm okay? Oh, okay, I'm okay. God has already said you're okay through His Son, Jesus Christ. More than okay. More than okay. It occurs to me that last song we sang, that it's God's love that helps us mind. Did you see the double quotes around mind? Mind your manners, mind yourself. Any sort of self-regulation that comes from self-awareness is, again, I believe, dependent on God helping us mind our behaviors, our thoughts. As we begin this morning, that's on. Can we switch it over to the remote? Did you? Yeah. Have you ever pulled up to your garage door and hit the button and nothing happened? Yeah, we're kind of used to that door starting to go up, you know. And I'll just keep. There it goes. Perfect. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, there we go. I'm going to keep clicking to make sure that we've got it here. The remote still doesn't want to connect here. Okay. Thank you. That's perfect. Thank you. You have been such a big help all week long. Thank you so much. Wow. Breaking the cycle. Not repeating the either negative stuff or the thoughtless habits of others. And we particularly think of that as adults. Perhaps there were certain things from our childhood that we experienced that were no so good. And we don't want to repeat those in our own lives. And so we make conscious choices based on that awareness, and we break that repetitive cycle. The same is true of our daily habits that we develop, and that we have to somehow replace a bad habit with a good habit, because it's just simply too hard to stop any sort of particular habit. We're creatures of routine and habit and structure and that kind of thing. I bet for most of you, you have slept on the same side of the bed for most of your life. Just sort of a habit. I don't know if it's a random thing. Hey, honey, you want left or right? Left or right? You know? No, you kind of go to your side, and there it is, you know, and you probably have a favorite shelf in the refrigerator, a favorite burner on the stove, kind of that go-to burner, front left or front right. I don't know which one you are. I'm a front left guy, but and that's the one that gets the most dirty. But anyway, when we think of different habits and cycles and whatnot, we're going to talk about some very predictable, very noticeable interactions that go on that kind of provide some of the basis of family systems theory. And really, systems theory is just that. It's seeing things as a system. And particularly, it notices how the electricity of anxiety moves through a system. And so that's what we're going to talk about here today. So systems thinking strives to look at the emotional process going on among people. Have you ever sort of sensed the mood in a room when there was no words being uttered? You can tell by the expressions on, even my dog can tell whether I'm happy or sad. You know, we wear our expressions in our mannerisms, on our face, and there are other signals that we pick up on that will tell us what's going on inside or simply emotionally. Now, when I say the words emotionally, I'm going to talk to the men just a minute. I'm not talking about the last 3 minutes of a Hallmark movie. Okay? Emotions, again, are what drive us in addition to our thoughts. The two work together, but they sometimes work against each other. And again, our emotional vocabulary may consist of just 5 or 6 different emotions: happy, sad, angry, joyful, whatever. But really, we are complex creatures that can experience hundreds, if not even thousands, of emotions. And we're often aware of our thoughts, and we're often aware of the surface emotion that we're experiencing, but not often the root emotion of what's going on, let alone that of others. Perhaps you've uttered the word, I'm still talking to the men, honey, what's the matter? The next word you need to key into is the word fine. If that word fine is uttered, you might ask an additional question. And the same is true of us as well. Oh, I'm fine. We're kind of taught to just sort of move on, not talk about what might be bothering us or whatever else. And, oh, I'm fine. It's fine. Or it'll be fine. But rather than trying for control or blaming others, and we're going to talk more about that in our worship hour, the human reaction to want to blame others is incredibly strong. As a little boy, I even tried to blame the dog for certain things that happened and that kind of thing. And my parents didn't fall for that. But it's a human reaction to try to control others or to blame others. I'll just go back and read the quote here. Rather than trying for control or blaming the other, one tries always to better manage yourself. Manage yourself, to mind yourself, and one's own contribution to the situation. Because that is the one and only person, by God's grace, that you have opportunity to change, is yourself. That doesn't mean that it's okay or acceptable for others to abuse you in some manner. But the fighting chance, literally, that you have to be the sole person that changes somebody else, they have to want to change. And again, the only person we have any amount of control to be able to change is ourselves. I know this is kind of a long quote, but this book was given to me years ago, and I wished I'd read it starting the very day I received it, because it was so helpful in understanding myself as an adult when I look at the generational flow from my family of origin, and understanding that who I am today is a product of every single day that I've lived since the time I was very small. But I want to focus in on the underlined, Dr. Murray Bowen saw how the emotional process took over in families in which one member of the family was having a lot of emotional problems. And so instead of just focusing on that one, quote, challenged person, he focused on the whole family, because what he discovered was that to such a degree, they were being led by their most anxious and dependent member. The same is true at work. The same is true in any sort of system. That the most anxious or dependent person is often sort of setting the agenda because much of the attention is being drawn to them. And the world is full of overfunctioners that willingly come to that person's aid, so we see how things can fuel the other. The connection that Edmund Friedman made was that churches and synagogues operate in the same, but actually a much more complex way, because, again, we're a church family. We're a gathering of families, and we all bring both our joys and our challenges. And yes, I am grateful that the Bible is full of stories of dysfunctional families. We'll continue. Dr. Murray Bowen partnered with Michael Carr to write the book Family Evaluation. And we're going to talk for a few moments about individuality and togetherness. Now, to first talk about togetherness, togetherness is a good thing. But in contrast to individuality, what we're talking about with togetherness is, and it's that second quote on the screen, it's a life force that propels an individual to follow the directives of others, to just sort of flow along with the crowd, and not really do their own thinking. Like a school of fish, who's driving that bus? They're all sort of flowing together, and really none of them are perhaps self-determined. They're just following the crowd, if you will. And so that's what we're referring to in what I'll call an unhealthy togetherness, is that you're just sort of flowing along with the crowd, right? Which we tell our young people, if someone jumps off a cliff, are you going to do so? You know, we kind of give these crazy examples, you know, to not fall into peer pressure, right? We see stories in Scripture about peer pressure. It's how John the Baptist lost his head because he had made a promise that because of the people around him, he didn't want to look bad. And so he had to follow through with this promise, even though it just pierced his heart that he was having to give that order. So again, we see in human interaction oftentimes people doing things, and we find ourselves doing things because we feel pressured by the system in which we're in. Individuality is what motivates independent feeling and thinking and acting for oneself, and I love this next phrase, with a lack of concern for what others feel, think, and act. Now, that doesn't mean that you're insensitive to others and that you're a bully, but it means that you're making decisions for yourself and for the reasoning and rationale that you have developed, which of course includes feedback from others, but you're living your life with your own sense of purpose and not living it out trying to meet the expectations of others. Humans were created to function each as a separate person and to follow one's own compass. That's what makes us unique to the rest of the animal kingdom, if you will, is the ability to choose, the ability to experience life in an emotional way. Individuality pushes you hard from the inside out, whereas togetherness pushes strongly from the outside in. That's another way of looking at it. So if it's pushing from the inside out, it's toward being my own unique individual and distinct, and that God created me as what the Bible says, a masterpiece. By the very hand of God, each of us are individually created. He didn't have to make every snowflake different. He didn't have to make but even twins who look very much alike are not completely and totally identical. There's a fun word to say that when you find, somebody, I have a friend in Wyoming who is about my height, about my haircut, has a beard, and I call him my doppelganger. And Kirby and I have been good friends for a long time. We had kids about the same age that went through academy together, and we would see each other and whatnot there at Campion Academy for various events. And so we'd always try to take a photo, and the photos that we take together, we're both smiling ear to ear. It's just kind of fun. But yet, I'm a preacher, and he's an eye doctor. There are many things that are very, very different about each other. So again, God has wired us to be unique individuals that have a unique contribution to His greater good, His greater plan. Togetherness, again, is pushing from the outside in. It's pressuring us to conform and to be part of the group and to lay aside your own personal principles. We talked about principles last night, and your own commitments. So again, that's basically saying you don't have to think. which is what social media has done to many people. They simply scroll and scroll and, well, I wonder what I think about that. Oh, look at this. Oh, that's what I think. Really? Have you really stopped and done your own research and homework to decide, is that what you really think about that particular thing? So again, that togetherness, it starts in the very earliest years of our awareness. As little bitty kids, we have this desire and this sense of wanting to belong. And yet, instead of being an individual early in life, we tend to focus more on the togetherness. You know, every 4-year-old has a best friend. Just ask them, hey, who's your best friend? Well, this week it's Johnny. And the next week their best friend is somebody else, you know. Because there's this sense of wanting to draw close together, and that's very natural. But as we mature and as we become grown adults through that whole wonderful process called adolescence, which some of us get stuck in, but there's this wonderful process of going on of becoming an individual. So when we think of individuality and togetherness, the problem is relational fusion. Let me read and then I'll comment. Relational fusion occurs when one person dominates, the other dissolves. Do you think that's how God designed things to be? No, it's not. We each have a place. We each are loved with the equal amount of love and grace by God. We each deserve to be happy and to lead a life of choices. But relational fusion, again, is the overtaking or the overshadowing of someone else. And again, that party that dissolves into subservience, they might think they're just being nice. They might even think they're being cooperative. It could be a very, very strong personality and a very mild personality. But again, I think you can see the healthy interaction does have an amount of crossover, but it's not the majority. Whereas fusion, it's almost a complete eclipse, one from the other, to where if we use the illustration of a planetary eclipse, one literally disappears behind the other. Again, too many words on the screen, but there's a balance between individuality and thinking for oneself, and there's a time to go along with others, in agreement with others, but that's also when it's in agreement with your values. So again, making the right decisions for the right reasons. But when you take two healthy individuals and put them together, you have a healthy relationship. When you have a situation of codependency or fusion, you have an unhealthy relationship. And it's unhealthy for both parties. One is being too overbearing, and one is being too subservient and really not being themselves. But relationships are less troubled when both parties are healthy individuals. There is less anxiety, less worry over what others may think. Our responses are more appropriate and based more on fact and thinking through things, and life is much smoother. And this life is governed more by thinking and planning based on objective fact and logic and principle. Again, this is what it looks like when an individual is living out their well thought through and prayed over values, and not just caving into what somebody else is expecting them to do. One or two more slides on this concept, and the others, we have a little bit fewer slides here. The individuality of a very well differentiated person is developed to the point that they can be responsible for themselves and not fault others for their own discontents. Again, that's the blaming others. Togetherness needs are such, while people are attracted to and interested in one another, their functioning is not dependent on others' exceptions or approval. Now, that's certainly welcome. We crave the approval of others, and yet if our life depends on it, we're living from the outside in, right? This degree of self-containment, coupled with the fact that expectations of one another are governed far less by infantile or immature need, but by the realities of cooperation, resulting in a relationship that spawns little anxiety. Perhaps you've been at Walmart and overheard a couple bickering at each other. And again, you don't have an emotional connection to what's going on, but they do. In fact, it's mostly emotions that are bursting forth in words. But because you don't have that emotional tie, maybe in your mind you're thinking, you know, what they're arguing about is kind of ridiculous. You're able to think that very clearly because you're not overcome by any emotions over it. It has nothing to do with you, right? And you probably shouldn't be doing one of these, like, ooh, you know. But again, you happen to overhear. But for those two people that are going at it, again, their emotions have taken the lead, and they've allowed the situation to go far beyond their logical thinking, and again, until at least one of them calms down just a little bit and is able to, again, do some real thinking about what's really going on and say, you know what, why don't we get one of each, and we'll try that. Let's buy one of each, and we'll go home and see which we like better and whatever. One of the greatest principles of marriage that I learned from Elder Alex Bryant, our North American Division president. When he and his wife first got married, they were struggling, I'll just use the word struggling, over whether the peanut butter should be kept in the pantry or in the refrigerator. How many think it should be kept in the pantry? I see a couple. How many think you should keep the peanut butter in the refrigerator? Okay, a few of you are sleeping. That's okay. That's all right. It's still early. The solution was to get 2 jars of peanut butter. Put one in the fridge, put one in the pantry. Again, was this really something that should be causing such a great deal of conflict? But that thought finally occurred when the emotions were a little bit less. I love this quote from one of my favorite books that goes by many different titles, but the classic title of this book is Desire of Ages. It's a book about Jesus. And on page 87, it talks about his character, his emotional maturity. Jesus possessed a dignity and individuality. When I saw that word, I was like, oh, I've been studying about that word. What does this paragraph say? Jesus possessed an individuality wholly distinct from earthly pride and assumption. He lived purely from the inside out. He did not strive for worldly greatness or the approval of others. That I inserted in a parenthesis there. And even in the lowliest position, he was content. Do you think he was a hard worker? I think he was a really hard worker. We traditionally think of his father, or his earthly father Joseph, as a carpenter, which could either involve pottery, stones, or wood in that era. I traditionally think of wood. And I love the smell of freshly cut wood, you know. And again, I think of Jesus working side by side with his father there in the carpentry shop and doing everything carefully, methodically, so that chair or whatever they were assembling, not creating, but assembling, was just right, taking pride in his work, but again, from the inside out, not seeking the approval of others, even though a compliment is nice to get once in a while. But again, an individuality wholly distinct from earthly pride and assumption. Powerful statement. From the Message translation, Galatians chapter 6, verses 4 and 5. Again, I like to read different translations of Scripture each year. And a couple years ago, I was going through the Message, which was put together by Eugene Peterson, a pastor, who saw his Wednesday night prayer meeting group going to sleep. And so he began with the book of John, and he just sort of rewrote John chapter 1 in his own words, and he shared it with his Wednesday night prayer meeting group. And they enjoyed it. They loved it. They thought that was, hey, can we do John chapter 2? So the next week he worked on John chapter 2. The next week, John chapter 3, 4, 5, all the way through the book of John. And at one point, you might remember finding the Message translation only New Testament. And eventually he was able to go through the entire canon and include the Old Testament. So again, this is a paraphrase, not a word-for-word translation from the original language, but I think it puts things in a contemporary light here. Make a careful exploration of who you are and the work you have been given. Those are two separate things. Who you are and what you do. Okay? And then sink yourself into that. Throw yourself into that. Don't be impressed with yourself. And don't compare yourself with others. Oh, how tempting that is to do, whether you're a young person or an older person. Each of you must take responsibility for doing the creative best you can with your own life. This is a call to self-determination, to self-direction, and again, under God's watchful eye, under His plan of what God is calling us to do, our vocation, our unique calling. So we'll leave individuality and togetherness. I always say the word too fast. And we'll get to over-functioning and under-functioning. And that kind of represents all of us in the room. Again, where togetherness and individuality are a bit of a seesaw. One is higher than the other. Over-functioning and under-functioning are the same. When there are two parties, you often have one that is an over-functioner and the other who is an under-functioner. But let's look at the definition. Over-functioners are always busy. Does that word trigger a bell? Busy? Has that word come up in conversation any time this week? I think we're all busy, aren't we? But this is a different kind of busy. Over-functioners are always busy, but they are busy going about someone else's business because they lack the ability to set clear boundaries of what their own goals and the needs of others. So without clear boundaries and guiding principles, over-functioners anxiously help and do for others what others could easily do for themselves. So the over-functioner is doing for someone else what they really could be doing for themselves. This is motivated by an unhealthy need of approval, sought by meeting the expectation of others, which often leads to an unhealthy codependency. So that's, I will say that that's one aspect or one root cause to overfunctioning. Perhaps you grew up in a family with siblings and you used to have breakfast around a table, with chairs, to illustrate, Johnny comes down for breakfast. He's about 8 years old. And Mama asks Johnny, did you make your bed? No, Mom, I didn't make my bed. Well, go ahead and eat your breakfast. And Mama goes upstairs and makes Johnny's bed. Does Johnny ever have to learn to make his bed? No. He knows that Mama's going to do it. Now, again, there was a famous graduation speech given by like a lieutenant colonel that was based on the idea of make your bed. Kind of interesting. But it's one of the first things we can do each morning that kind of sets a little bit of order to our lives. So the principle wasn't necessarily about sheets and blankets, but it was about, having a few little chores to be responsible for so that Johnny would learn to have some discipline and follow through and do things and contribute in that way of keeping his room nice. But as long as Mama goes upstairs and makes Johnny's bed, Johnny can continue to underfunction and not do it for himself because someone else is. And while he's eating Cheerios, Mama's upstairs doing for him what he should be doing for himself. Now that's a very, very simple example. It gets a lot more complex when both parties are adults, and again, both parties could easily do whatever that task is, or whatever that function in the family might be, whatever leadership or even feeling. There are people that worry for other people. I'm doing your worrying for you. That's a form of overfunctioning. So our friend Moses, unmistakably called by God to lead his people out of Egypt. I mean, there is no question that Moses is a special boy who grows up into an incredible man who, again, was not without fault. At age 40, he really took matters into his own hands and murdered an Egyptian in front of witnesses. And the next day, he finds himself leaving Egypt and fleeing out into the desert to begin a whole new life. Probably the first example of the witness protection program. I don't know. But he leaves the comfort that he had been granted as one of the princes of Egypt, and he runs away. And for the next 40 years, he gets married, and has a family, and watches sheep. Right? We all know the story. And then the burning bush at age 80. The burning bush and God's voice and the excuses of Moses. Oh, no, not me. I'm slow of time. All the excuses. If anybody could list them, he could. Here's all the reasons why I shouldn't be doing this. But God persistently providing his brother who was already hiking his way out, before the bush even became lit. Again, God orchestrated all this. And so we find Moses back in Egypt, in front of Pharaoh, time after time after time, plague after plague after... You know the story from Exodus. And miraculously, God brings his people out with great riches. I mean, the Egyptians are heaping onto them gold and silver and all that. How do we think they got all that stuff to make the sanctuary later on? But again, Moses is readily seen as the human leader of all that. Well, we come down to Exodus 18, just before the commandments are given, written in stone. And Jethro comes for a visit, his father-in-law, the father of his wife. And he just notices what's going on. And he also notices how worn out Moses is. And he says, Moses, my man, you are killing yourself. You're having a people bring all of their problems. All of how many people? Over 600,000? I can only imagine that from morning until night, he was dealing with problem after problem after problem. Because he was telling people, I'm the leader, so bring all your problems to me. But God had not asked him to do that. It was a blind spot of his that he didn't understand that he was not meant to overfunction and do for others what they should be doing for themselves. I need to be developing other leaders and share this responsibility of leading God's people. And so, even though his heart was very, very committed, he had a very overcommitted schedule and was wearing himself frazzled. Overfunctioning originates more from a place of human ego than we might like to admit. But as we looked at earlier this week, it is not God's calling for you to be overwhelmed all the time. There are seasons in which there's just a lot going on, but again, on a regular basis. But when we overfunction, it allows others to underfunction, right? It allows Johnny to not worry about ever having to make his bed, or it involves others never really cleaning up after themselves because they know that at some point, a newlywed couple, this is kind of a joke, a fable, if you will. He says, honey, have you discovered the magic counter in our apartment? It's a magic counter. It's incredible. I leave dirty dishes on it, and the next morning they're gone. It's incredible. And of course, what is she doing? She's rolling her eyes, putting it in the back of her head, like, are you kidding me? Again, taking turns doing household tasks and all that kind of stuff, and again, saying, I'll help with this, the lawn, the trash, the vacuuming, whatever. If you'll do this, the bathrooms, this, or whatever. Kind of dividing out the tasks or whatever it may be. But some questions asked regarding over-functioning. In what ways am I sustaining the underfunctioning of others? And this is important to ask as a parent, and as a leader, as a boss, or even as a family member when we think about those various systems. And how does this affect my ability to have a regular Sabbath, to have rest, to have balance in my life? The lie that overfunctioning doesn't just whisper but shouts in your ear is you are the only one holding this all together. If you stop, it's all going to fall apart. That, I think, again, is unrealistic, and it might even be mixed with a little bit of ego, but it's mostly this driving desire to be seen as the hero, to be seen as competent and hardworking, and those are all good things, and yet an addiction to those things is not good. So it goes by many words: the Superman complex, the Messiah complex. Those individuals might say there's no rest for the weary, or self-care is a sign of slacking off. If I stop juggling, all the balls will fall. And that is true as a working parent who's trying to go back to school. Okay, that's meant to be layer upon layer upon layer. That's a lot of balls in the air. And at some point, God enables us for periods of time to keep all those balls in the air. And there are other times when it's like, I cannot keep this up. And so there are choices, sometimes difficult choices that we need to make to address our overfunctioning. But when we stop overfunctioning, it rocks the system because the expectation from others is that we will. I mean, Johnny expected that Mama would just make his bed. So again, he didn't have to, and he didn't even need to want to. He knew that that's how the system worked. And the same is true when we lean into the space of others and do for them what they should be doing for themselves. It again might seem like an act of service, and yet over time, that particular thing might be better done by that individual for their own responsibility. Many churches are organized around the over-responsibility of clergy and other key leaders. The 80-20 principle: 80% of the work gets done by 20% of the people. That's true not just in churches, but in some organizations as well. On Wednesday night, we took a quiz that most of us failed. But it's just to help us realize that we might have tendencies to overfunction in particular areas of our lives and that kind of thing. We won't go through this line by line, but there was a handout that we all looked at together. But I don't think what we looked at then, we'll just look at the left-hand side. I'm sorry that the print is so small. But overfunctioning and underfunctioning may not matter on a day-to-day basis, but when anxiety presents itself, which tends to accentuate or magnify any sort of dysfunction, that's when it can really start to matter. And so the left-hand column there is, if you overfunction under stress, these may be some indications. You feel you know what's best, not just for yourself, but even for others as well. I know what's best for you. And, you know, again, that comes from a very anxious spirit. No, I know what's best for you. You move in very quickly to advise or rescue or mediate or even take over. You have difficulty sitting back and allowing others to struggle with their own problems. We all know what happens when we find a caterpillar cocoon that is becoming a butterfly, and that butterfly begins to break out of the cocoon. And if we were to peel that back for them, they'll likely die. Because in their development, they need to grow and strengthen those muscles as they're breaking out of that cocoon on their own in order to then rest for a little while, and then they fly away, and it's awesome. So if we did that for them, and they didn't have their own struggle to go through, they're not going to develop to the point of even survival for a butterfly. We avoid anxiety about our own personal goals and problems by focusing on others. That's another pretty major issue of overfunctioning, is when I'm really not caring for myself because I'm so busy caring for everybody else. And sometimes that just comes because of the situation. Many of us reach a stage in life where our aging parents require our care, and yet we still have a full-time job, and maybe even still kids at home. There's just so much that needs to be done and cared for. But that doesn't mean we should be avoiding our own anxiety and mental health. We have difficulty sharing, being vulnerable, especially with those who are viewed as having problems. Because again, overfunctioning also comes in the form of wanting to be viewed as having it all together, that you're stable. You kind of look for those compliments here and there, and that's the last one of that column. Two more concepts that we'll cover, and we'll actually refer to this one in the next hour. But every one of us is involved in a triangle of some kind. They're not to be avoided, but carefully navigated. And the definition that we'll unpack a little bit more during the sermon time is the basic principle of emotional triangles is that when two parts of a system become uncomfortable with each other, okay, they're in conflict, right? That they will triangle in a third person as a way of stabilizing their own relationship with one another. Has this ever happened to you? Happens a lot. It even happens when your phone rings and that person that you know well is talking about a third person in a way that they're trying to maybe garner some advice or maybe even get you on their side or that kind of thing. But triangles are a very natural part of life, just as conflict is that leads to triangles. Because most of the time in a conflict, we think we're right. And the other person is wrong. If they'd only see it. And so then we might triangle in a third person and say, can you see how right I am about this? You're kind of trying to bolster your position with that other uninvolved person. Meanwhile, the third person is going, well, I guess if they're not going to call me back or they're not going to talk to me, and that's where sometimes emotional cutoff takes place. You have a conflict, but you don't resolve it, so you just stop talking to each other or avoid each other. But again, that third person can be a stabilizing force. But that third person becomes the target of the anxiety. So person A is at conflict with person B. So person A reaches out to you, person C. And what often is happening in between the words or beneath the words is they're just trying to feel less anxious about the situation. They may not even be interested in solving the problem. In fact, if you find yourself maybe offering some, well, here's something to think about, or what you might do is, because again, you're trying to give them a few suggestions, help them out, some advice maybe. If they seem to be ignoring your advice, again, their sole purpose is just to feel better about the situation. In fact, sometimes at the end of a conversation, a person will say, oh, thanks for talking, I feel so much better. And like Bob Goff, who says, I don't want you just to agree with me, I want you to do something, right? So the you at the bottom, and those are kind of funny cartoon, they're all males there, I guess, but the target of the anxiety, you have to resist overfunctioning, saying to person A, you know what, I agree with you, let me call person B and fix this for you. No. That, again, would be fueling the triangle and overfunctioning for person A. Person A may need some real help and assistance to address this very difficult problem with person B. I'm not saying just leave it to them and they'll figure it out. No. There are times in which, would you like me to go with you as just a silent ride-along when you talk with person B? And using language, so when you talk with person B, maybe you can ask them such and such. Again, trying to push the responsibility to them and assisting in a way that they'll hopefully resolve the conflict. Lastly, we have scissors and Elmer's glue. We've been around it since kindergarten. One is made to separate and one is made to stick, right? And very simply, Emotional fusion, again, is if anxiety about being separate is intense, a person tends to get too close or too entangled with others. Remember the two circles that were two? So this is the one that's trying to disappear or eclipse behind somebody else. That's fusion. And then cutoff, which is, I think, a little bit more common. If a person's anxiety about being close is intense, he or she gets too disengaged or too remote from others, which is emotional cutoff. When you have a conflict that you're just not quite sure how to address with someone, that's different than the emotional cutoff where you simply stop talking to that person for weeks, which the more weeks go by, the more months go by, the more years go by. There are family members, blood relations, who haven't talked with one another for decades because of emotional cutoff. Some type of conflict came up between them, and neither one had the maturity to approach the other and say, can we talk about this? Even if we disagree, can we at least stay connected and talk about this? But again, you can't change the decisions or behavior of the other person, only yourself. You can make an effort and then pray that God will move upon their heart. And again, not pray that they'll see how wrong they are. But again, that you can have a dialogue, you can have an exchange about that. But again, rather than standing out, a person who cuts off is standing apart, or even standing against, or standing over. Like in Luke chapter 18, Jesus said 2 men came to the temple to pray. One of them a publican, a Pharisee. And here was his prayer. Lord, I thank you that I am not like this terrible person over here. Again, comparing himself to make himself look and feel better about himself. While that other person, Lord, and again, to beat someone's chest. We see that very few times in Scripture, but that's one of the most humbling and submissive motions that you can do in Eastern culture. Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner. Those were the 2 prayers. And again, this whole idea of having a superiority complex over everyone, which really comes from a place of insecurity in that person. 1 or 2 more slides here. Emotional fusion causes one to be more influenced by peer pressure and to have a diminished capacity to distinguish between thought and feeling. So what goes along with emotional fusion is often emotional reactivity. Emotions tend to outpace rational thought, and that person is typically very dependent on others, but also very emotionally reactive. The two tend to kind of show up together. And then, again, cutoff. System theory describes cutoff as a withdrawing or a disengaging from others, which is not differentiation. Differentiation, a healthy sense of self, allows you to approach that person in a non-threatening way and say, can we talk about this? We've kind of covered that. So some thought questions to consider is to maybe identify some ways that you are over-functioning, particularly when anxious or stressed. And again, we'll unpack that quite a bit in the next hour as we look at how Jesus interacted with anxious people and called them to a higher level of behavior and thinking. What may be driving your impulse to overfunction? There's always things that need to get done. And we know the phrase, if you want it done right, do it yourself, right? It's a lot easier, a lot quicker. But things can pile up, right? Like a plate at potluck, you know? It can pile up. And then how might you approach triangles differently with a new awareness about maybe what's going on behind the scenes? It's easy to want to overfunction and intervene on behalf of that conflicted person that's reached out to you and form that triangle. But again, dialoguing and keeping the focus on what they might do to solve the situation is a healthier way of doing things. I want to close with prayer, and then we'll take a short break before our worship hour. Thank you for listening. Heavenly Father, we have touched on a lot of different principles of how we interact emotionally and relationally. Lord, teach us to be good stewards of our thoughts, our feelings, the things that we value. And also, as we become more and more aware of those things in ourselves, teach us to be sensitive to the experience of others, that we might bear the fruits of your Spirit, love, joy, patience, and peace. And the last one being self-control. Again, God, this is only possible by your Spirit, and we thank you. In Jesus' name.